everyone, welcome, and today I'm going to be talking about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. What are the processes? How are they similar? What are the differences? And what is the relationship between the two? So first, let's get started with photosynthesis. Now, photosynthesis is a cellular process where plants make their food, which is glucose, and give out oxygen. Now, to make this, they need the help of solar energy, water, and carbon dioxide. Now, how do these enter inside of the plant? Well, with carbon dioxide, plants, they have tiny openings called a stomata. It is where carbon dioxide comes in and oxygen comes out. Now with water and other nutrients, they're absorbed by the plant's roots. With solar energy, it is also absorbed, but with a pigment molecule called the chlorophyll, which is the side of the chloroplast that I'll get to it in a sec. Now the chlorophyll, it is what absorbs the solar energy. Now in the chloroplast, it is where it takes solar energy, water, and carbon dioxide and turns it into glucose and oxygen. Now with the glucose, it is used by the plant as their food and energy, and oxygen is released into the atmosphere. Now let's dive into the chloroplast. Now the chloroplast, it is in a plant cell. It is where the chlorophyll is in. Now the chlorophyll, it is stored in the thylakoids. Now a stack of thylakoid is called a granum. Multiple stacks of thylakoids are called a granum. Inside of the thylakoid is called the lumen, and outside of the thylakoid, yet still in the chloroplast, is the stroma. There are two primary steps in photosynthesis and inside of the chloroplast. There are the light reactions that happen in the thylakoid and the Calvin cycle, which happens in the stroma. First, let's get started with the light reactions. Now, the light reactions are actually used by two photosystems. They're photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. They're embedded in the thylakoid membrane. Now, in the light reactions, NADPH and ATP is created. But first, let's take a look at how ATP is created. Everything happens in photosystem 2. Light energy and photons go into the chlorophyll reaction center and create or make the two electrons become energized in photosystem 2. They become so energized that they escape photosystem 2 and head into an electron acceptor molecule, which is in the electron transport chain. And to replace those two electrons that have left photosystem 2, H2O or water is divided, releasing two hydrogen ions, two electrons that are now in photosystem 2, and oxygen which goes into the atmosphere. Now the two electrons in the electron acceptor molecule continue to head down the electron transport chain, releasing stored energy as they do. They eventually head into photosystem 1. Now these energy that's being released actually creates hydrogen ion gradients that happen in the stroma. Now a protein in the electron transport chain pumps those hydrogen ion gradients into the thylakoid lumen, creating a high concentration. Now the high concentration is actually used by an ATP synthase, which pumps those hydrogen ions out, and it actually adds a phosphate to adenosine diphosphate, or ADP, and converts it into adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. Now that is how ATP is created, but what about NADPH? Well, those two electrons that have been left in photosystem 1 again become so energized to do the photons and then escape photosystem 1 and enter into the second electron transport chain. Now, how does photosystem 1 replace those two electrons? Well, it actually takes the two electrons that have escaped photosystem 2 and bring it to replace those two electrons. But how does photosystem 2 replace those two electrons that are now in photosystem 1? Well, again, H2O is divided, oxygen is released into the atmosphere, and the two electrons go into photosystem 2. Now back to the two electrons that have become so energized. Now in the second electron transport chain, or at the end of the electron transport chain, the two electrons are actually combined with a hydrogen molecule, which reduce nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate, or NADP+, and then are converted into NADPH. Now, that is how the light reaction has occurred. Let's just take a little overview. All of this happens in the thylakoid, the light reactions, and water and sunlight go into the light reactions. ATP and NADPH is created, and oxygen is released as a byproduct and goes into the atmosphere. Now, what happens with the ATP and NADPH? What happens to those two? Well, that is where the Calvin cycle kicks in. Now, the whole purpose of the Calvin cycle is to convert carbon dioxide into glucose, which the plant can later use. It uses the ATP and an NADPH from the light reactions along with carbon dioxide and turn it into glucose. Now, in the Calvin cycle, there are 3 phases. There is the carbon fixation, reduction, and regeneration. First, let's take a look at carbon fixation. It is catalyzed by an enzyme called rubisco. It actually captures and combines the carbon dioxide with an RUBP, or ribulose biphosphate. And what happens, it actually makes it unstable. Now, what happens since it's unstable, it actually quickly splits into 3GP or PG. And then later it heads into the second phase, reduction, where ATP and NADPH come in. Now, the 2 molecules of 3PG are actually added by a phosphate from ATP, and then are reduced by NADPH, and then are actually combined into 6 G3P. Now, one of the G3P goes to make as a starting block for glucose, and the rest of the 5 go into the third phase, regeneration. Now, before we get started with the third phase regeneration, what happens with the ATP and NADPH? Actually, the ATP is turned into ADP, and NADPH is turned into nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide phosphate, or NADP+. And they head into the light reactions to be converted back into ATP and NADPH. Now, heading on to the third phase, regeneration. What happens is, an ATP is used with the 5 G3P molecules, and then are turned into RUBP molecules, which then can add additional carbon dioxide, starting the whole entire cycle again. Now, that is with the Calvin cycle, but let's do a little quick overview. Now, in the Calvin cycle, NADPH and ATP from the light reactions go into the Calvin cycle along with carbon dioxide to make ADP and NADP+. And glucose is turned as a byproduct, and with the ADP and NADP+ go into the light reactions to be converted back into NADPH and ATP. Now, let's combine the whole entire process together. All of this happens in photosynthesis inside of the chloroplast. The light reactions happen in the thylakoid, and the Calvin cycle happens in the stroma. What happens with the light reactions? It takes light and water and turns it into ATP and NADPH. And oxygen is created as a byproduct and goes into the atmosphere. And the ATP and NADPH is used in the Calvin cycle along with carbon dioxide to make ADP and NADP+, which go back into the light reactions to be converted back into ATP and NADPH. And sugar, or glucose, is created as a byproduct, which the plant uses for its energy and food. But now let's head into cellular respiration. Now, cellular respiration, it is where organisms break down nutrients to produce energy in the form of ATP. It is where glucose and oxygen is converted into carbon dioxide, water, and energy, or ATP. Now, this all happens inside of the mitochondria. However, there is one step that happens in the cytoplasm. Now, there are 3 primary steps in cellular respiration. There is glycolysis that happens in the cytoplasm, the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle that happens in the mitochondria, and the electron transport chain that happens in the mitochondria. Let's first head into the first stage, glycolysis. Now, in the glycolysis, it is where the glucose, it is broken down to produce energy. Now, it all takes place in the cytoplasm of a cell. It is an anaerobic process, so it actually doesn't require oxygen. And in the process of glycolysis, glucose is actually converted into 2-pyruvic acids, or 2-pyruvate. Now, however, it all needs 2 ATP, but later on, it actually will make 4 ATP, making 2 ATP in total. And it also makes 2 NADH. Now, NADH is a coenzyme that has the ability to transfer electrons, which help to make more ATP later on in cellular respiration. Now, in glycolysis and before the Krebs cycle happens, there's an intermediate stage between those two. The 2-pyruvate are transported to the mitochondria. They are oxidized, converting them into 2-acylate-CoA. Carbon dioxide is released and 2-NADH are produced. Now the second phase, the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle. This all happens inside of the mitochondria. It is an aerobic process, so oxygen is required in this process. What happens in the process is the remaining carbons from the initial glucose are oxidized. Carbon dioxide is released and 2 ATP, 6 NADH, and 2 FADH2 are produced. Now, FADH2 is also a coenzyme like NADH, and like NADH, it assists in transporting electrons to make more ATP later on. And finally, the third stage, the electron transport chain. This is where the most ATP is produced, and like the Krebs cycle and the citric acid cycle, it is in the mitochondria and it is an aerobic process, so oxygen is required. Now, in the electron transport chain, what happens is the electrons are transferred from the NADH and FADH2. They are quickly swapped by hydrogen ions that are pumped out of the center of the mitochondria into the outer complex part of the mitochondria. However, they want to quickly come back to the other side of the inner membrane, and they do this by going through a special protein called ATP synthase. Now, the ATP synthase, just like in photosynthesis and in the light reactions, adds a phosphate to adenine diphosphate or ADP and turns it into ATP. Oxygen is the final acceptor, which is then combined with 2 hydrogens to create water or H2O. Now, going through how much ATP is produced during this process, there is an estimate range of how much ATP is produced in the electron transport chain and the whole entire cycle of the glucose, the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain combined. There's an estimate range of 32 to 34 molecules of ATP produced in the electron transport chain. Now, if we were to add the Krebs cycle, the glycolysis, and the electron transport chain together, it adds a total of 36 to 38 ATP molecules per glucose molecule. However, this is all just an estimate range of how much ATP is produced. Now, with that is the process of cellular respiration and photosynthesis. However, let's go into the similarities with each other. Now, they actually both involve the production of ATP or adenosine triphosphate. And in the production of ATP, both involve the electron transport chain and the ATP synthase, which we reviewed and studied that the ATP synthase adds a phosphate to ADP and turns it into ATP. Now, with photosynthesis and cellular respiration, both of them actually take place in cell organelles, and they both involve multiple steps and many of the same molecules like oxygen, carbon dioxide, water, glucose, and ATP or adenosine triphosphate. And what's actually quite similar with these two is that plants, they actually can do both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Now, let's head into the differences with each other. First, let's start off with photosynthesis. Now, with photosynthesis, it is an anabolic process. So it actually uses energy to grow and build. Despite that both photosynthesis and cellular respiration happen in cell organelles, with photosynthesis, it happens in the chloroplast. And the steps of photosynthesis is the light reactions and the Kalman cycle. However, with photosynthesis, it can't do it without the presence of sunlight. It only requires light to do so. And it actually takes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and produces oxygen. And with the energy, it captures it, converts it, and stores it. Now, with cellular respiration, it is a catabolic process, so it actually uses energy to break down molecules. And it happens in the cytoplasm and the mitochondria. With the steps, it's the glycolysis, the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. With cellular respiration, it doesn't require any sunlight. It doesn't need the presence of it. So it can occur in any time, both light and dark, both day and night. And it actually takes oxygen from the atmosphere and actually produces 2 carbon dioxide. With the energy, it releases it in the form of ATP. Now, despite that they might have differences and with each other, they actually have a relationship with each other. Now, with the relationship with each other is that they allow life to survive. the reactants and products from both are direct opposites. With cellular respiration, it creates glucose, oxygen, and turns it into carbon dioxide and water. Now with photosynthesis, it uses carbon dioxide and water and turns it into glucose and oxygen. So in cellular respiration, the reactants are actually the products of photosynthesis, and the products of photosynthesis are the reactants of the cellular respiration. Now both of them take a huge important part of the carbon cycle. They actually help to keep the carbon dioxide and oxygen in the atmosphere stable or steady, and they actually help each other. With photosynthesis, it requires carbon dioxide, which cellular respiration makes, but actually cellular respiration needs the oxygen to do so. So photosynthesis provides that with. And with photosynthesis, it actually needs water to do its process. And cellular respiration creates that water, but it actually needs glucose to do so. So photosynthesis makes glucose so the cellular respiration can make water. But one thing that's really important about photosynthesis and cellular respiration is that both of them help to keep life living. Thank you so much for watching my presentation.